if you're going to make change, it's going to be in concert rather than in isolation. Change usually comes societally through movements rather than, one person being on a soapbox and can't be heard amongst the crowd, as it were. So that's a good place to start, is that if we're looking to initiate change within the industry, you want to be shoulder to shoulder with people who have a similar or like vision. Alignment is so important. I think in any relationship in life, alignment potentially is actually the most important thing. The most important thing, because if we're not aligned on our values and our visions, we've got like a massive problem from day one. And that actually, if you just take that principle to contractual relationships, are we aligned? Half the battle with negotiating a successful contract between the parties is we need to actually have a common vision, a common goal, and are we aligned? And that means actually some of us conceding some stuff along the way to get there.
Hi everybody, Gavin Coyle. I'm the Gaffer, back again with another great guest. And today's guest has a fantastic profile in the area of QS and dispute resolution. And we've spoken on numerous occasions in the past about the fairness of contracts and how they need to change. But are we changing them in the right direction, and what are we doing to make those changes? So what we're going to talk today about is the humanization of the contract, and how does that evolve and what does that look like? Well, my next guest has actually living that strategy at the moment and has real life examples of working with clients on that basis. And his mantra is to put down the pen and paper to a point and say, okay, let's take this mutual negotiation of a contract up to another level, to a level that we can both talk to each other in a room and be fair with each other and be honourable with each other. And let's bring trust and values to the contract and let it not just become a black and white situation, because construction is not black and white. And Ray Mellor-Pike is Managing Director of RMP Consulting Southern Limited, and he's here today to tell us exactly how that evolves. Ray, we're delighted to have you on the podcast. Can't wait to get in touch with your inner beings and how this operates. And yeah, tell us who you are and where you came from first, because I think your profile fits exactly into where the audience will be looking for.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So in terms of actually my background, I've got the best part of 22 years in the construction industry, been spread across just about every sector that you can imagine, in terms of actually all the various sectors that we're used to seeing in terms of main contracting, PQS related work, subcontracting. So from my standpoint, I actually started residential as well, and so from my standpoint, I actually started life as a PQS. And it gave me a really good grounding for quantity surveying principles, to the extent, a lot of those principles still remain with me today in terms of actually the type of work that I'm doing now. And I've almost sort of come full circle back to a consultancy type of arrangement, with my present business. And so I spent roughly 3.5 to 4 years in a PQS practice to start my working career. Gave me a really solid grounding. It was interesting as well because I originally moved over from Canada, so I'm originally from the west coast of Canada, and I moved to the United Kingdom when I was 19. When I joined that private quantity surveying practice, I think they could hardly understand me because I spoke so fast and with such a profound Canadian accent that I remember them pulling me to one side and they said, "We're going to need you to slow down because no one can understand you. And we're probably going to have to give you a bit of a crash course in the Queen's English so that you can exist in this world." So yeah, it's almost like I had my mind remapped in the ensuing 12 months after that. But it was really good. Gave me a good, really, really good grounding. I then moved away from private quantity surveying work at that point and really wanted to experience something more of the built environment. Even though I was involved in a wide cross section of different projects doing employer's agent related work, contract administration, I wasn't seeing a lot of the day-to-day construction activities to the extent that I wanted to. So then I moved into residential and I did resi work for roughly 2.5, 3 years. And I got to experience a lot more of what the built environment looked like and see construction projects on a more regular basis. But I was still a little bit office bound, as I think a lot of residential QSs typically are. And so I then I actually went back to private quantity surveying work for a period of 6 months after that. That's when the recession hit, and the business made a raft of people redundant, one of which was myself. And so I thought, well, I've 4 different job offers, and I thought I quite fancy going back to PQS work and seeing if I get myself chartered. So I went back to PQS work, and then as that recession really started to bite, they made probably 3/4 of the office redundant, and I was caught up in the last round of redundancies, and then just swiftly found myself in the main contracting world. And I was very fortunate in that I had a poacher become gamekeeper type scenario, in that when they made me redundant, I actually went and worked for a main contractor, for which I was doing some life cycle costings on the PQS side for on some of their projects. And so asked the PQS practice, I was like, look, don't think there's a conflict of interest here. It's about the only job going at the moment in Dorset that I can find. And so I'd be ever so grateful if you give me the green light to go and work for them. So I went and worked for Morgan Sindall for the best part of 11 years. Really enjoyed that. And that was effectively, those were my real formative years in construction, if I'm honest. And I really enjoyed main contracting because I was on site every single day, and just got exposed to so much more of the building tech side and in the built environment, and how just buildings go together. And so you find that you've got a rapid learning curve in that respect. And so I really enjoyed that part of my working career. And then I moved back into a bit of resi. So I got to a stage where I really wanted to advance my own career path, and I worked for an excellent office at Morgan Sindall, to the extent actually where if you looked at, up the chain of command, it appeared like no one here is moving anytime soon. And that's fine, because they're all really good people. They had such a strong commercial department. I couldn't blame them really for retaining and keeping the people that they had in those positions of command, because they were excellent at their jobs. So I thought, well, if I'm going to progress my own career path at the pace that I want to progress it at, I'm probably going to have to move elsewhere. So I went to a brownfield site resi business. Most of the sites that they dealt with were brownfield, dealt with on a scheme that was roughly 55, 60 million quid or thereabouts, which was sort of 3 high-rise concrete frames. And then COVID hit. So we just got to the end of the procurement process on that particular site. We were like, oh my word, all the procurement's done. We can just cost control to the end of the job. We were in a really strong place. CBR was knocked into shape, and then COVID hit, and the wheels just rapidly fell off, to the extent that we had quite a large site office. Just about everyone was made redundant except for me and the site manager. And I sort of took one look around and thought, I'm not sure I feel all that secure here. And so I actually went and worked as for a subcontractor, a facade subcontractor, as their managing QS. Was with them for 12 months through COVID. And that really opened my eyes to the struggles that subcontractors go through in the industry, and just how fast their world operates, and the tensions that they operate in. They're sandwiched between other subcontractors, and they get potentially the most unwieldy contracts in the industry. And so that was really interesting from my standpoint, and that actually kind of led me towards where I am now, where I always kind of had a flair or an enjoyment for the contractual side. Like, I loved reading like the legalese, which is probably not all that common, because a lot of people don't really have the stomach to sit there with a contract or find it all that enjoyable. And I was just like totally nerding out on reading contracts, to the extent where when I was working for that particular subcontractor, I was reading, tenders coming through the door, reading terms and conditions, reading subcontract agreements, because being at the MQS level, I was heavily involved in negotiating and finalizing those terms. And so I felt that I was essentially reading contracts on speed for the period of 12 months, and thought I'd quite like to do a lot more of this, really, at some point. And at that stage, I think I actually had my own business running as a bit of a side hustle, looking at some subcontract terms and conditions, getting involved in the odd dispute where subcontractors were in a bit of a tangle that they were struggling to unravel. And so I moved back to main contracting for the best part of 18 months. Worked on a fairly large scheme, which is the hospital is about 145 million NEC contract, commercial team of so 9 surveyors on the site plus myself. So it was just this massive administrative machine in terms of administering an NEC contract on that sort of scale. And then I got to the stage where it became apparent to me, I was like, now's the time to make the move into doing what I love doing and want to do every day. And that's where I found myself now, doing the consultancy work that I do now, which, it's a wide cross-section of contract reviews, dispute resolutions, mediations, negotiations, and also with a bit of nuts and bolts QS work to boot as well, when that presents itself. So yeah, that's kind of taken me to where I am today.
The power of going to the big guys can't really be underestimated when you're growing your expertise, I believe. I don't think we place probably enough emphasis. Like, I know a lot of companies or a lot of people like to stick with the small guy, and the small guy is the guy that gave me the start. But somehow or another, if you don't taste or see the corporate powerhouses that actually deliver on what you actually do and see it from a higher scale, you might not agree with it, or you might challenge it and say, that's not the way to do business. But at the end of the day, they're doing it at scale, and they've got all these models built out, and they have the currency under the table to be able to shift, and they have the clients that can prove that they can deliver. So it's interesting you went downstream then and sort of got the reality of what's happening under the car.
Yeah, and it was really like kind of like when you lifted the lid off that and you actually saw the inner workings of the subcontract machine. When I was actually looking at some of the contracts that they are operating, they're like totally down in the minutia in terms of delivering, fabricated entities to site to install, and like all of the machinations they go through with the design and iterations of trying to figure out how to make that work from a design standpoint. I suddenly just viewed everything so differently than I did before, because I was in the main contracting world, in the PQS world. You're almost viewing it from a 30,000 foot perspective, and you don't see all the definition of or the detail of what's going on behind the lines. And then when you actually do see the detail, you're like, oh, okay, I understand actually some of the tangles and arguments that we used to have with subbies. I suddenly could see it from their side, and you start relitigating in your own mind actually some of those dialogues, thinking, yeah, I think I was probably a little bit unreasonable there, and
you would have been I think, sorry to cross you, but you would have been involved in the hard knock conversations on the main contractor side, where you would have been defending the main contractor, and rightly so, because that's what your position was at the time. Yeah. So who's right and who's wrong?
Well, it's interesting because just actually going back quickly to what you're talking about with doing time at a tier one contractor, I think you're very right that they have something that other corners of the industry don't. And obviously, I think main contractors get a lot of backlash and that they're the butt end potentially of a lot of criticism in the industry. But at the same time, they equally have their own challenges, as you're alluding to. And by doing time at a main contractor, or even a significant period of time, it does really up your contractual game, because on any given site you could have just a wide cross section of subcontracts, and so you see a lot more contracts. I personally saw a lot more contracts on the main contracting side, and got exposed to a lot more contractual disputes and a lot more contractual discussion, shall we say, than I did on the PQS side, because I just had the turn of subcontractors. So we're having these dialogues just over and over and over again. And you're knocking out subcontract agreements all the time. So you become fairly contractually sharp. And and also equally, if you're working for a tier one contractor, there's all sorts of terms and conditions and amendments and training that you get, JCT training, NEC training, because they want you to be appropriately trained to administer these contracts in a live environment on a daily basis. And so I think you're quite right, to say that there is a lot of value in spending some time at a tier one contractor. And then equally, when you go on to your next question, as in who's right between a main contractor and a subcontractor, is so circumstantial. I get involved in so many different disputes and negotiations and mediations now, where I'm jumping in on, it feels like you're getting on board a bullet train half the time, because you get called when that dispute is fairly advanced, and then you are trying to jump on board that bullet train and maneuver through the carriages as quickly as you can to find where you need to be at to actually make some sort of determination as to who's right and wrong. And it can all be rather vague. You might have both parties have administered the contract in a totally shocking way, and so therefore it's a total melting pot of faux pas, or you might find one party's got another party like absolutely over a barrel. So it is very circumstantial. And then sometimes you actually find that morality comes into it. Well, that's something we'll probably touch upon today, is that I think as an industry, sometimes we can be devoid of a strong moral compass in terms of there have been times. I think I might have been one of those rare QSs with a heart. QSs sometimes are actually referred to as. I've heard the saying that we're
really choked there. Sorry, what did you say?
You're like, sorry, what now? But it's funny because quantity surveyors, I'd heard the phrase like QSs are the group that come in and sort of bayonet everyone after the battle's been fought, and they're on their last gasp, that we're sort of a heartless bunch. But there are some really good QSs in the industry that can try and pull themselves back and act in an impartial manner. And so I can think of a handful of times actually where I was looking at a subcontractor where they were dead to rights from a contractual perspective, but you had to apply morality to that situation and be like, what was right, what was wrong. So I had one subcontractor, for instance, probably had the best part of £20,000 worth of contract charges that could legitimately be levied in their direction, and they could do nothing about it. But it wasn't the right thing to do because they'd done everything they could on that job to deliver it for us. They left a lot on the table in terms of contractual entitlement that they legitimately could have gone after. And so you have to almost put that into the calculus to understand what is the right call to make, because the heartless one is not always the right call, in my personal opinion anyway.
That's a beautiful story.
Did it make you cry?
Yeah, well, it makes me cry that people don't see the risk and get themselves caught up into these contracts, because when I listen to you, there's so many complexities and variables within the industry of where you operate within that circle of QS and commercial agreements and negotiations and disputes resolutions. There's so many areas that can catch you out, that there's some very intelligent people that put together some very, very complex documents that are purposely designed to become tripwires for people who don't understand what they're walking into. And somebody who has a very strong work ethic, great moral compass, looks after their employees, but just might not have the nuances to understand that this is a contract you shouldn't be writing or you shouldn't be signing. That worries me, and that's one of the reasons why we set up the podcast, was risk management, risk profiling, understanding that it's good to say no to a contract and walk away. And you should actually trend on how many contracts you don't take as opposed to how many contracts you do take, because the ones you don't take actually reinforce your business model of, I'm only small, I'm only this size, I can only deliver that particular type of a contract.
Yeah.
But what type of a contract is a contract that's a fair contract in your mind? Like, is it a contract that is a simple contract that's just, black and white, what I will deliver in terms of a scope of work, what you've given me in terms of a bill of quantities, and everything that I've matches with your bill of quantities? And I'm talking at a very granular level, obviously. But there's nothing wrong with something like that. And then a handshake at the end of it to say, here's the milestones that we will deliver on.
Yeah, and in terms of actually determining what is a quote-unquote good contract, it's probably a bit of a subjective question, but nevertheless, if you'd ask me, what would comprise one, I think just zooming out and starting as a first, I was to use one word, I think it'd be clarity. So when I was compiling contracts for main contractors, I would try and delineate as clear as possible in that contract who was doing what and what were the associated deliverables that we all needed to carry out, and what were the implications for not carrying out those specific deliverables. And yes, in answer to your question, I think contracts should be shorter. The reason why, the more convoluted they are and the more laden they are with legalese, the less likely it is that your subcontractor and your subcontractors in the industry will be able to comprehend what's being said. And that's not a slight on those businesses at all, because I had an arrangement once where a roofing contractor said to me, after we had successfully maneuvered out of a bit of a sticky dispute for which he had very little, if no, contractual entitlements, we managed to get the other side of that and actually acquire a half decent result. He said, "Oh, thanks ever so much for doing that." And I said to him, I was like, "You know what, mate?" I was like, "You're amazing at roofing. I read contracts and I negotiate for a living." I was like, "If you get me to do some torture on roofing, I'm probably going to light my trouser legs on fire, and we're going to have a much bigger problem." It's we stick to what we're good at. It's horses for courses, isn't it? And but I think at the end of the day, if you had shorter contracts, I think what's good, for instance, about the NEC contract, it's still not a short contract, but I think what's good about it is that it uses common language. So that's a good start, is that it's slightly easier to understand in that respect. But I think that in terms of actually what comprises a good contract is like having a very clear scope of works. That's a really good starting place. Having documentation that aligns with that scope of work. So we've got drawings and specifications that are not wildly departed from that scope of work. So if we've got natural conflict in a contract to start with, you and I are probably set to have a bit of a bang up at some point. And so what you're trying to actually do is to, as the drafting party of a contract, clarity, you don't want conflict. Those are two really good starting places. And in terms of deliverables, time. So, do we have a clear program, sequencing, all of these things are really useful, like clear payment terms. It's in trying to ensure that you have the clear fundamental bases covered, but not to the extent where now I'm throwing the kitchen sink in and I'm coming at you with a whole load of sweeping liability clauses. It's like, well, that's not really actually where we started life. And if the subcontractor pricing this at the front end was to be looking at those liability clauses, you're probably looking at a much more expensive contract sum. So yeah, there's many different things that make up a good contract, but I think, clarity, lack of conflict, and it does really help for it to be more succinct, I think, are some good starting points if you're looking at it from a high level standpoint.
Yeah, but everybody's shooting for the utopian contract. Here's the utopian contract. We've allowed for everything in this. There's no stone unturned. So it's not as if he didn't know or she didn't know what they were walking themselves in for. And I just can't get over. Maybe it's because I come from the health and safety side of things, but it seems to be sort of hold your cards close to your chest approach towards QS and the commercial agreements. And I'm making more money than you. You know that. I'm not going to tell you how much money I'm making because that's for me. It's my prerogative, and it's my client. So you're working for me, and I'm your client. And so I'm playing sort of cat and mouse with you because, by the way, I'm putting 2 mech and elect contractors on this contract. So if you mess up, I'm going to give more work to him or her. And if you mess up, I'm going to give more work to you, or whatever way it's going to work. So now you have a battle of 2 mech and elect guys on a contract because you set up this sort of pseudo system to dangle carrots in front of people. And, just like we're designing and complexities into models that stop productivity from my mind that I see what's happening. And then it ends up into just a big clash, personalities and people getting around tables, and then people getting demotivated and then saying, well, I'm not doing bank holidays for you or Saturdays or overtime for you if this is the way you're going to treat me. And by the way, I'm doing a job up the road and I'm getting far more work done and I'm giving them a far better job because you're the one that's just being an ass to me on this project. So
Yeah.
I can't understand why people just don't come together before the contract starts, designers included, procurement, commercial agreements, safety, whatever else, pre-start workshops. Here's the culture of what we want to achieve on the project. It's a culture of
Yes.
openness, transparency. If you mess up, come up to the office. There's an open door.
Yeah.
Mess up a second time, we will have a chat. But mess up the first time, put your hand up and come in and talk to us. And let's
Yeah.
create this sort of culture program that this project is going to be based around. And people talk about
Yeah.
culture, but they just bring these marketing companies in to throw the name culture across the front of the billboards to say,
Yeah. It's a buzzword, isn't it?
zero this and zero that, and
Yeah. Yeah.
blah blah blah.
It's almost a lip service at times, potentially, type arrangement. And it's interesting as well because you need rights and entitlements in a contract. You kind of do need rules of engagement because, using that first principle that I was highlighting, clarities, it can add an awful lot of clarity when you get in a situation where you're like, oh, hang on a minute, something hasn't gone right here in the contract. I think you might be in breach. What's the rights and entitlement? But let's not get crazy with it to the extent where we're adding a whole raft of amendments, sometimes even amendments to contracts that are larger than the contracts themselves. And you're thinking, man, I think we've actually got away from the whole spirit of what we're trying to achieve here. And
Spirit is exactly what the word I was looking for.
yeah, and what's the intent of what we're actually trying to achieve here? Are we going to be working as a team, or is it basically going to be an arrangement that where as soon as I put one foot out of line, you've got the chambers loaded full of bullets and you're going to let them fly? And so what I can actually find I'm doing a lot of now in terms of de-risking contracts at the front end is a lot of contracting parties will come to me with it, be they subcontractors, main contractors, subcontractors, whoever. What you find is that a drafting party of a contract is going to draft that contract probably in a landslide in their direction. And that's kind of understandable because I'm thinking, like, if I'm going to be drafting a contract, I'm like, I want to make sure that I'm sufficiently protected. And because we are trying to look out for number one, per se, that almost is kind of human nature. And then what we're actually trying to achieve, or personally what I'm trying to achieve, is to actually put that closer to some sort of parity, to try and make this arrangement a bit more fair, a bit more collaborative. As you say, like to set the culture off on the right foot. Even when I carry out those negotiations aren't from a you bunch of thieving so-and-sos, what you're playing at. They're from a perspective as in, I can understand why actually this contract's written this way. I can fully understand where you're coming from. Just obviously, the door swings both ways here. If you're looking at it from my client's standpoint, there's a whole mountain of liability that's actually written into this contract that's directed at them. And I think, we just need to have a sensible discussion about all of it. And actually what you find is 9 times out of 10, you have a sensible discussion about it. And so long as you get the key hill to die on clauses knocked out and deal with the wave tops of what you're trying to achieve, you get to a sensible place. And then actually they have a nice start to the relationship where the subcontractor or subcontractor or contractor, whoever it is, the receiving party of that contract, doesn't feel like they're in a position where they're probably losing from day one. And equally, the other party, if you go about it in a sensible way, they think that wasn't really actually all that bad. And they might actually think, well, maybe we do actually need to have a look at our contract because maybe it is a bit onerous. And actually, if they've gone through a journey, maybe of 2 or 3 meetings trying to actually get to some agreed terms, they think we're all wasting a lot of time here. Whereas if we had something slightly less onerous, I've actually had negotiations where we get 15 minutes into a discussion and they look at the mountain of queries. I had one that I looked at the other day, 377 comments on it because it was just rammed full of liabilities, to the receiving party's back teeth of things that they would be liable under their contract if they were just to have executed it. And, I've had contracts where there's been so much that has actually been born out of the contract review. They take one look at it, and I had one guy said to me, I've actually had more than once, where they said, should we just go back to the unamended version of the JCT? I'm like, that'd be wonderful. Because the unamended version of the JCT, it sets your rights and remedies in a fairly fair place to start with. It's not always fair. I mean, there's certain liabilities in the JCT I'm thinking that could do with looking at, but it's a damn sight better than, 300 pages worth of amendments from a starting point with a contract that's only 100 pages long.
What about somebody to act as a mediator during the construction process between the principal contractor, main contractor, and the subcontractors? That I'm not calling them, like, I'm not going down the union route. I'm not going down the dispute resolution route, as in individuals with dispute resolution expertise, but somebody that has a commercial mindset that is there to protect the spirit of the contracts between all parties. Is there models that you've seen where that's happening, or is that just, you've signed the contract, get on with it?
Yes, there's different models to kind of sort of manage this arrangement. There's one that the RCS have. I can't remember actually the acronym off the top of my head, but there are different models that are in place. I think the tricky thing that we find as an industry is sometimes we actually play lip service to these things. It's difficult to extract human nature out of humans, in that we're in business to make money, and it's like, but how crazy do we get with that?
I see a QS with QS written on his back, or her back, and they look at something and they go, he's going to lose money on that. And you know what I mean? As opposed to somebody that might come in with an unbiased view. I don't care. I'm neither on that side or on that side. I just want to make sure that there's harmony here. That doesn't happen, does it?
Not really at the front end, no. I mean, you typically have mediators descend on something when it's all gone a bit sideways already. And so you do have kind of various mechanisms in place, and I think there are people who are trying to make a concerted difference in the industry. But the battle, you do feel like you're climbing Everest to do it, because the industry is so steeped. Like, if you're talking about culture and how the industry operates, it's so steeped in an adversarial culture, because the contracts are written typically in an adversarial way. So we're already starting our relationship in a bad place half the time, well, more than half the time.
Untrusty. You're coming from an untrusty point on both sides. I don't trust you and you don't trust me. You're here to get as much work out of me for as little as possible, and I'm here to get as much work out of you for as much money as possible.
Yeah.
It's not really a good mix to start with. Like,
no. You're already primed for a fight from day one. What is interesting, though, and so, like, I don't want to give the industry a bad name, is equally at the same time, what you sometimes see is, sometimes you see businesses have really onerous contracts, but they have QSs that apply them sensibly. And so equally at the same time, you do find that there are people who are conciliatory within the industry that do have a moral compass, and so it's a mixed bag, really. But I think what we're actually trying to do is to move the industry to a place, hopefully, where we don't have the label on us that we're the industry with the highest rate of insolvency out of all other sort of practicing industries in the country. I mean, that's not a great label. I mean, that does probably tell us that something's fundamentally broken. But I think that's something, it's like Rome wasn't built in a day, and Rome wasn't torn down in a day. It's going to take some time, but I think we're going to need an army of people to start to move the needle back in the other direction. That people to get on board with an ethos that, hey, the way that we're doing things, this isn't working. And by the way, what we're probably going to find actually is if we carry on down this road, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to leave the industry that aren't going to want to operate businesses in the construction industry because it's too high risk.
You're rinsing out the supply chain, and you'll only rinse it out so much. And it's happening already.
It is.
There's not much left. So, like, I always cite the Boeing situation where, they subcontracted out so much parts of their business to the point that, we don't build planes anymore. We put them together, but everybody else builds it and then sends us the product in a box, and we just put it together like a mechanical set. And
sure,
when planes start falling out of the sky, questions were asked. What have you done to your supply chain? What happened to the old great American model of building planes? And it's fascinating for anyone that's listening or watching. If you go onto some of the footage about the Congress and how they're stripping apart the CEO of Boeing and the management team, and what their thought process was, they were obviously making very sort of matter of fact comments themselves to back up what they've done, but they can't get away from the fact that whistleblowers and everybody else came to the table and said, "Yeah, we knew this was going on for ages, and we just had to get on with it because the machine was Boeing, and then everybody wanted to attach themselves to the machine because they thought that's where the money was." But ultimately, what was happening was real people were being savaged and being, used, if you like. And when you look back at things, the supply chain was getting rinsed out to a point that the quality was starting to suffer. And in fairness, Boeing are making great moves to change that, and I don't see any reason why they won't come back again. But the construction industry, there's elements of that. You see that in the construction industry where they're just rinsing out the supply chain to the point.
We need to do things differently. And it's interesting as well because there was something you just said when you were obviously talking about Boeing there. The two words that jumped out the most to me were real people. We're dealing with real people. We're dealing with people's livelihoods. I mean, if you actually distill this down to the kind of the most simple entity of what's going on is, it's all transactional, totally get that. But you're dealing with people's livelihoods. And so in terms of actually one dispute that I looked at recently, I had a subcontractor that effectively on the last payment notice, it's always on the penultimate one or the last one, an enormous sum of money was held over a series of fairly innocuous defects, which actually didn't relate to the subcontractor in the off, just from a starting point. And we got there in the end in terms of actually acquiring the result for the subcontractor in terms of full payment. But it was a month of heartache, and we were literally a hair's breadth away from it going to adjudication. And what was so upsetting about it is the subcontractor that was on the receiving end of that dispute, I got a front row seat on how just unbelievably stressful that was for that person. Because that person's got bills to pay, a business to run, mouths to feed, and suddenly it's like their whole livelihood is potentially put at risk for what effectively is a payless notice that is not even spurious at best. It's completely and utterly fabricated and totally out of step with what the Construction Act is purporting should be the case. And so we're dealing with real people. And I think that's the thing that always got me when I always tried to have relationships with my subcontractors when I was working for main contractors. Because it's like we always had good negotiations, or almost always had good negotiations. And I like to think that I got good value for the business through those good relationships. I usually had better arrangements with the subcontractors I had good relationships with in terms of, there would be the odd item that they take on the chin and vice versa. But at the end of the day, we both, got to the end of the job and hopefully made money. And, had a handshake and we walked away rather than, there's only a handful of times where I was at loggerheads with a subcontractor. And it didn't go well, really. I would much prefer the former rather than the latter.
Well, this leads me on perfectly to your vision on what you're doing with your clients. And, I'd like you to talk to us about your principles of what you're trying to achieve with your client base and what you're trying to achieve in your industry as a sort of I'm changing this. I'm changing this up. And if you want to get on board with the Ray Mellor-Pike model, well, here's what it is. So why don't you give us some insight into that and tell us how that's operating and what are you achieving from these principles?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So just kind of by preface, me being a one-man band type business, I collaborate with a lot of other people that have almost like a unified vision, as it were, in one way, shape or form. And so I think as I was previously highlighting before, is that if you're going to make change, it's going to be in concert rather than in isolation. It's change usually comes societally through movements rather than one person being on a soapbox and can't be heard amongst the crowd, as it were. So that's a good place to start. Is that if we're looking to initiate change within the industry, you want to be shoulder to shoulder with people who have a similar or like vision. Alignment is so important. I think in any relationship in life, alignment potentially is actually the most important thing. It's the most important thing, because if we're not aligned on our values and our visions, we've got like a massive problem from day one. And that actually, if you just take that principle to contractual relationships, are we aligned? Half the battle with negotiating a successful contract between the parties is we need to actually have a common vision, a common goal, and are we aligned? And that means actually some of us conceding some stuff along the way to get there. But the other thing was there was kind of like 6 key principles. So when you and I were having a bit of a preceding discussion and talking about what we both do within the industry, and in terms of actually trying to initiate change, for me personally in the corner of the industry that I'm working in, if I was to kind of distill it down to 6 points, and this isn't exhaustive, but it is a good place to start. I've got kind of 6 items. First one would be collaboration. So the parties need to commit to work in collaboration with one another. There needs to be an unequivocal commitment on both parties, not a lip service one, but that hell or high water, we're going to try and make it work between us. Because if you have that starting place, you're both going to be committed. You're both not going to want to let each other down. Build that relationship. You need to have a relationship. You're much less likely to fall out and have a dispute if it's not just a transactional type arrangement, but actually we're working together, like hand in glove. We're going to try and deliver this together. And you actually sort of see that becoming more prevalent in terms of the wording in contracts that are commonly used within the industry. So if you look at the NEC contract, clause 10.1, we will work in mutual trust and cooperation. It tells first clause in the contract is like, we're trying to set off on the right foot, and actually try and sort of remind parties of that, in the most diplomatic way possible, that at the front end, guys, just so we're clear, this is what the NEC says. Let's work from that standpoint outwards. Because what is outrageous is you can get an NEC contract with a boatload of amendments. You're like, that doesn't look like mutual trust and cooperation to me. Does it look like that to you? And immediately, once you actually, pull the ace out, the ace of spades out, that is mutual trust and cooperation, I'm like, so maybe let's have a chat about these amendments, because that's not, going back to what you're saying, it's not in the spirit of the contract anymore. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you see it actually prevalent now in JCT 2024 suite of contracts, that, collaboration is now a feature, which previously, it wasn't. And so I think there's an awareness within the industry that we need to try and set off on the right foot. So I think that collaboration and building that relationship, starting things collaboratively as well in the tender process as well, like, right from day one, let's try and work together. That's probably going to keep you away from the precipice of a dispute or an adjudication, if you have that as a good foundation to build the house off of. The second kind of point that was really prevalent in my mind is communication. As soon as a problem's known, both parties commit to talk to one another and resolve it as soon as possible. If you have that commitment from day one, that as soon as there's a problem, let's talk about it, because we are collaborative. Collaborative means we're going to be talking to one another. We can't be collaborative in foxholes lobbing hand grenades at each other. That's not the nature of collaboration. So communication is and this is almost like it's funny. It's almost like you're talking about like marriage counseling right now, because you actually talk about these principles. But it's true, because any relationship is predicated on collaboration and communication. If you're going to have a good relationship, you need a solid foundation to work off of. Without that, it's all a house of cards, really. So so those two are kind of sort of really prevalent in my mind. So you look like you're primed to say something.
No, I like you could nearly just close off on those 2 points alone: collaboration and communication.
Yeah.
I know you have 6, but like, geez, are we seriously just talking about that we can't get around the table and be honest, upfront, transparent, communicative, and all one? I still can't get my head around the fact that we are still in this day and age not able to get past the first 2.
Yeah, Yeah, it's really interesting as well. And I think sometimes, actually, just as an aside, I think some of the disputes that we end up in at times can be as a result of like lazy contracting or lazy management or lazy quantity surveying principles, because um, you're trying to rely on something in the contract to hook onto to defend yourself from something that might actually legitimately be your problem. And it's like, well, tell you what, let's be honest. It's like, where did this problem originate?
Yeah,
And and
I think compromise is a word that's probably strong in that regard, because I think people get entrenched in what they see within the contract as the defense of their argument on both sides.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's the key thing as well, is that we don't become so infatuated with our own defenses that we can't actually sort of see the truth. Sometimes you kind of, when you're in the middle of the battle, you get the fog of war and you can't see with any sort of clarity, or you get emotionally involved. I think emotions are wonderfully effective at fogging your judgment. And so I think also sometimes with keeping this collaboration and communication is sometimes actually being self-effacing and detached enough to be able to identify what the real problem is and to work together. Because it might be actually, I mean, we don't really live in a society that likes to really admit our wrongs, from a liability standpoint, because, it's the classic insurance policy type arrangement. The second you admit liability, it's like all is lost. But if you've got a really good relationship with one another where you don't even actually need to start wielding the contract because you're working in lockstep, and sometimes you admit your wrongs and be like, yeah, that's actually my bad. Well, can we work to fix this together? It's not a bad place to start from, really. So I think those are kind of two really good linchpins that give us a good starting point. And then the other one as well, that as I was kind of thinking about it, is there was a guy that I used to work with, his project manager, and his saying was that his word was his bond. And so it's like our word should be our bond. We should keep our word. I mean, I couldn't count the amount of times in construction where someone denied that they said something and I knew full well that they said it. It was like, I've got a pretty short memory. If there's one thing I've got, it's a near photographic memory. And I'm like, bro, you definitely said that. Like I can almost like date stamp that in my mind when it happened. And so I think it's really important that our word is our bond, that the parties to commit to honor their verbal communications made. Because I think the key thing is the way that these contracts are written typically is that if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. Let's get to the place where we actually start honoring the things that we say, even if it's a bit painful, because I don't think we're going to make concerted strides to improving the situation in the industry until we become less disingenuous.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. Well said.
So your word is your bond. Next one was unamended. Have a clear, unamended, thoroughly drafted contract. If we can start from a position of having, rather than having a JCT with an absolute catalogue of amendments, why don't we try and commit to have an unamended contract? And if it's not going to be unamended, let's keep it to a minimum. Let's not have all the broad sweeping liability clauses, that give us all the wrong footing to start off on. And I think as well at the same time, so if you're talking about subcontractor, main contractor, employer sort of relationships, proverbial flows downhill. Quite often you see subcontractors get the worst contracts in the industry. Maybe as main contractors, maybe let's look to do a better job of actually saying no as well to the employer, and actually saying, no, we need to negotiate this and think again. And I know obviously that goes on to some degree, but what we probably don't want to find is that we agree to a load of liability that we know we're just going to shove down the supply chain. And if it all turns to hell in a handbasket, the subcontractor is going to be the one that's, effectively getting a whipping. So I think, if we can aim to have unamended contracts, because I mean, if you read the NEC and you read the JCT, as the most commonly used contracts in the industry, it's not as if they're not onerous in and of themselves. I mean, they've got fairly clear lines of divisions, rights and entitlements and remedies and what that looks like. So I don't really think we need to add a mountain of stuff to that in any way, shape or form. And particularly as well, like as the further you go down the supply chain, the less acumen they tend to have at reading legalese. And so you almost feel like you're exploiting the supply chain, because it's like they'll look at a contract and they think, well, I just want to get on with my job. I want to start hanging doors. So they go and sign the contract. And then later on, it's like, when it all comes to, it's almost like a payday loan. When it comes to Barry, like flipping heck, I was like, I didn't read the small print. That's horrendous.
Um,
So
I know you're talking about fair payment.
yeah,
What about financial fairness?
how do you define that? Just out of curiosity, or what? Just so I'm clear what you're driving at. What's your definition?
What about the fact that everybody should be have equity in the game, so much so that I'm definitely sticking with the Ray Mellor Construction Limited company because I get more margin off their jobs and their jobs run so smooth that I've skin in the game and I'm going to give them the best of my lads because I'm getting better margin off them and they've been transparent enough with me to say, by the way, Gavin, uh, you've left 3% on the table. So we've put that 3% back over to you so that you can now raise your invoice 3% higher than what it was because
Yeah,
we know what the numbers are on our side. But equally, by the way, if this goes the wrong way for whatever reason, we want you to share the burden with us to get us out
yeah,
the
sort of a
contract.
rough with the smooth type mentality. Yeah, and it's interesting as well because there's contracts that actually, by their very nature, they actually do that. So if you're looking at the NEC option C, for instance, NEC option C, gain share, pain share type arrangement that's the order of the day, and it's pretty open book. So it's all there for everyone to see, and kind of the beauty of that contract, if it's administrated properly, is that in the gain share type arrangement, you obviously define what that looks like, and as you say, if you win, you both win. Equally, the pain share type arrangement, you can define what gain and pain looks like. So again, that can be also sort of almost liable to misuse potentially, but in its purest form, it's not the worst thing in the world. It depends. I think also you're trying to identify what gain or what pain. I think let's major on the pain side of the bracket. What pain could be legitimately borne by the supply chain if it went horribly wrong? What would actually be fair? Because obviously, who's got deeper pockets comes into play. But I think it's a fair discussion to be having. And equally, the other thing that came to mind as well is I distinctly remember actually when I was working for a main contractor once where subcontractor was looking at their application for payment, and they did legitimately just leave out an item that they were entitled to, and I'm like, I don't feel right taking this off of them. So I picked up the phone to them. I was like, you got a bit of a howler in your valuation. Just a heads up that you might want to correct that. And the amount of emotional capital that I acquired with that subcontractor through that one bit of honesty paid dividends. Like that was a check that was cashed for years. In that our relationship went to another level, and if I needed to call in a favor, they were there. They were there to help. And so this is actually where you kind of flip the mentality on its head, thinking, man, we're rather than us like taking chunks out of each other, if we were to operate in a more honest manner with one another, actually probably what you're going to find is people are going to be a lot more conciliatory when another person wants to call in a favor. You've got a natural working relationship and a good one at that, and that's often what I found with a lot of the subbies I was working with is like I almost have rinse and repeat with a lot of my subbies on jobs because we just had that working relationship. And it's not to say they excluded others and that they got everything, but you were you were a damn sight more likely to be using the subcontractor who you knew was honest and wasn't at it, in their account, and equally, you were the same back in the other direction. They knew that they were getting the same thing, so they were willing to give you a bit of discount at the front end of the job because they knew that they weren't going to get screwed to the wall, 6 months later when they're active on site. So I think you're right in terms of like parity or fairness when it comes to payment. There's many different ways that you can arrive at a conclusion there, or for both parties. But it definitely, I think, is also a salient point. And then,
That
like,
point
sorry,
five
carry on.
that comes into your point five of fair payment.
Yeah, so fair payments is interesting because I think we went through a period of time in the industry where there were some large main contractors that were struggling and they were stretching some long payment terms out, 90 days, 60 days maybe. even anything above 30 is a bit much for a subcontractor to swallow. And often actually you find sometimes in the industry that main contractors potentially will use that cash flow to support like an investment arm of the business. And so I think probably what we hopefully get away from is that using the party with less monetary leverage, using their cash flow to support another business's sort of investing arm, is probably not the most equitable thing in the world. And so, if you can get your payment terms, and there are drives obviously within the industry, public sector contracts, that's something that's quite big, is fair payment terms. But yeah, having sort of no more than 30 days really is a good place to start as well. So you're not stretching subbies out, because if they get stretched out across 1, 2, 3, or 4 more, contracts, and suddenly they can find themselves in a place where you're actually harming yourself. Cash negative, you could send them bust. And then what happens when you send a subby bust as a main contractor? Suddenly you've got a program problem. So it's probably not in your best interest either.
Brilliant.
And then last of all, the one that I always try and have feature in any contracts I'm negotiating is limitation of liability. Because if you do not have specific limitation of liability within a contract, if it's not specifically mentioned and what it specifically relates to, then by virtue of that, you have unlimited liability. So silence is unlimited liability. And so I think, if you can get to a stage where something standard, say, 10% of the contract value is the maximum liability in the way of penalties that the receiving party of that contract can swallow, then you're actually in a place where they're like, if it all goes a bit horribly wrong, we're already at a place where they've conceded on some level. So, you feel like you're working for a party that's got a heart, so you're probably going to give them your heart and soul in terms of carrying out the job. But equally, at the same time, you've got some peace of mind to know that I'm going to trade through this, as it were. And so I think limitation of liability is probably a good principle to have as well. And like I said, that list isn't exhaustive. But if I was shooting from the hip to give you a bit of a list, those are the ones that, came out of the bingo machine, as it were. And I think probably are good things to feature in any contract.
Yeah, I think you spoke about a charter. So this would fit into a sort of a charter, would it? Or what?
Yeah.
What that would be your idea, or that's the way you frame it, isn't it?
Yeah. Like if you had this as a charter from day one, before you even get to the position of actually talking about terms, you already know that you've got some key cornerstones to build your relationship off of. This is before.
That goes back to your earlier conversation about we come to the table and it's like, I don't trust you and you don't trust me position. Whereas if you have the charter and you have the discussion and maybe the pre-start workshop and say, hey, here's our charter. This is what it's kind of like your culture document. This is how we're going to operate as a project in a collaborative way. And these are our value systems in here, our value statements.
Yeah, because immediately in that point, you sort of say with these are our values. When you just use that word values, you send the message to the other party. We've got a moral compass. We're not a heartless transactional institution, and we want to work with you.
Brilliant. I love it. I'm going to throw a few curved balls at you, if you don't mind, Ray, because I like to do that.
Yeah, far away. Yeah, no problem.
Couple of questions just about you, maybe.
Sure.
Knowing what you know now, what would you do different in general? It doesn't have to be in business. It can be it could be a life question.
Well, okay, so let's do a business and life then. From a business standpoint, there are a handful of scenarios that I would like to relive where I could have been fairer. And also there's a few scenarios where I'd like to relive so I could stick my head above the parapet, where I effectively in that moment didn't have the stones to raise my voice and say, actually, I'm not comfortable with that. In terms of like where I was receiving a mandate, like this is what we're going to do with this subcontractor. I wish I could go back and relive that, because I'm quite a different person now than I was then. And we all have our regrets. But so I think there's a series of instances I think where that would apply. And from a personal life standpoint, I I would have liked to have learned the superpower of detachment at a younger age. And what I mean, the superpower of detachment, uh, it's something that I think we all could we can all lay hold of, which is basically it's a phrase. It came from a Jocko Willink podcast. I think that detachment is a superpower because what it does is it allows you to think with a clear mind, and it allows you to stop making, me anyway, to make uh, emotional decisions that probably later on afterwards I wish I could actually relive that moment and make a much more sound decision in that moment. And I think that actually borders into business as well, because if you do learn how to be detached, and it's interesting as well because there's one particular podcast I recall listening to where it was a Jocko Willing podcast actually, where he was saying that to learn the art of detachment, it's knowing how to pair what are your classic tells when you're getting emotional. So maybe your heart rate increases, maybe your palms get a bit sweaty, maybe you get a bit hot under the collar, might be all of the above. If you can start to pair those classic tells that you have, um, that I'm getting emotional to I need to detach, it's wonderfully effective because as soon as you have that almost like that paired association in your mind where I'm starting to get emotional and I need to detach, it becomes a knee-jerk mechanism to segue into detaching, standing back and be like, what's actually a good, sound, rational decision to make here? And by drifting away from the wall of emotion, that's inside you and thinking with a clear head. I wish I could have learned that lesson at a much younger age.
Well, I'll give you a personal story on that one. So I tragically lost a brother who drowned along with two other guys when they were 17 years of age, just throwing a ball to each other at the seaside, the Atlantic coast in the west of Ireland.
Wow.
And a freak wave came in and the current took them out to sea. So four drowned. One was brought back to life on the beach, but my brother and two other guys drowned together. So trauma, blah blah blah, whatever, you go through it as a family and as a community and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't until about 15 years later where I was part of a business organization, entrepreneurs organization. It's a global organization, and the penny dropped that I was making business decisions based on personal emotions.
True.
And it was pointed out to me because I was fiery as you are when you're trying to get your business up and running, and you
Sure.
want to run through doors and everything else. But I was making decisions. I was making business decisions that actually were having positive outcomes. But the positive
Yeah.
outcomes were only through actual chaos, if you like, really, when you look back at it. It was because I was being sort of, headstrong and going for it rather
Sure.
than, and there was a direct link with that and the loss of the brother in terms of detachment. And I'm not saying that I want to be detached from my brother, but I was kind of going, I channeled all the, anger and all the issues from the loss of the brother into a positive thing that I thought was like, I'm going to build my business and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I did,
Yeah.
but it was based on emotional stuff
Yeah.
that it was built
Sure.
on. And it wasn't based on something that was organic and authentic and natural. It was based on, raw emotion. And it
Yeah.
was when that was pointed out to me that it was a massive turning point for me,
Yeah.
that
Sure.
from even today, I was like, that doesn't come into my play at all anymore. And I'm much more level, I'm much more stable in terms of my approach to people and to life and to business.
Yeah. 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 And it's yeah. Thanks for sharing that. It is really important, isn't it? Because I think once you start to appreciate uh, how to become detached, you start to be able to view your scenario from a much more third person perspective. So, and you're allowed to, it certainly allows me to be able to empathize and understand other people around me better because I'm not so inside my own head. Um, and I wish that would have been a lesson that I'd learned at a younger age, but I'm glad that it's one that I was privileged to learn later on, and we're all students of life, and it was only just through kind of reading material and listening to it, I was like, oh my word, I've got an enormous blind spot here that I need to address. And so
Imagine going through your whole life and not recognizing that blind spot. Like, you're very, thanks for sharing it with us, because you're very, and it's a massive plus in terms of your business, obviously, that you have cleared up that blind spot, because without clearing that blind spot, you can't really stand over a lot of the stuff that you want to achieve, and I don't think you have the success that you would have without clearing that blind spot. And the fact that you said, look, hey, I've done that in the past, that's not me anymore, and I've recognized that I need to change. That's very powerful in itself. So well done, you.
No, thank you. And I think, you're quite right that I probably would struggle to negotiate and mediate effectively if I was emotionally involved. It's not that you don't get emotionally involved in things, it's just that when you're getting too sucked in emotionally to something. So it doesn't make you unemotional, it helps you to keep your emotions and your ego in check. And so you're trying to forever strike that balance, and it's not to say that you don't get sucked in emotionally from time to time. But what's good about it is, because you're aware of it, you're aware that it happened, and you take stock afterwards, and you're like, how do I stop that from happening again? And so I think we're all trying to become better people, aren't we, in one way, shape, or form?
Well, that wasn't scripted. That question was not scripted, by the way. So it actually fitted completely into the whole podcast in terms of humanizing the contract and
sign of a good show host.
Ray, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. What an amazing business you have, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you again in the future. If you could come back to us in the future, it sounds like you're creating a great cultural shift in both in terms of the contract, but also how people operate together in a fair and transparent and collaborative way. And I wish you every success with it.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Cheers.